The boy from nowhere. The auditorium was already buzzing with whispers before the moderator even called his name. Hundreds of students, coaches, and alumni filled the rows of Yale's Sterling Hall, the vaulted ceilings echoing with laughter, the scent of expensive cologne, leather briefcases, and polished ambition soaking the air. It was the final round of the National Debate Invitational, the single most prestigious debate event in the country, the stage that turned young speakers into future lawyers, senators, and policymakers. The crowd had seen dozens of competitors take this platform in sharp suits, their hair trimmed to perfection, their shoes gleaming beneath the lights. And then at last came Eli Ramirez. He walked across the stage wearing sneakers with the rubber soles peeling at the edges, a second-hand blazer that didn't quite fit his narrow shoulders, and a shirt that had clearly been pressed by hand earlier that morning. There was a brief hush as he adjusted the microphone. Not the respectful kind of hush, but the sort that comes right before a smirk. Someone in the second row chuckled, and the sound spread like a ripple. One of the polished Harvard competitors tilted his head with a smug grin, waiting for a punchline. A young woman from Stanford leaned toward her teammate and whispered something, her voice carrying just enough that Eli could hear the words, "Wrong place." The laughter was not loud, but it was sharp and it cut. And yet Eli's face did not falter. He stood steady, fingers brushing the worn edge of a stack of index cards that had clearly been handled too many times, as if he belonged on that stage despite every signal telling him otherwise. But this story, the one that would become legend in debate circles for years to come, did not begin on a polished stage at Yale. It began far from the marble, staircases and ivy-clad buildings, in a working-class neighborhood where most kids never even dreamed of setting foot in a place like this. Eli was 19 years old and came from Brookhaven, a town that rarely appeared on any map except as a dot along a forgotten highway in the Midwest. The roads there cracked in the winters, patched half-heartedly by the city until they split open again. The grocery store his mother worked at closed early on weekdays because the staff was always short. His father, when he wasn't bent over an engine at the auto shop, spent his evenings at the kitchen table balancing bills that never quite matched the paycheck. Their home wasn't grand, but it was steady. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and the smell of motor oil drifting in through the back door. While some kids grew up surrounded by bookshelves and tutors, Eli grew up surrounded by tools, grease-stained rags, and the steady rhythm of survival. Still, even in that small town where ambition usually ended with finding a steady job and keeping your head down, Eli carried something restless inside him. As a boy, while his father taught him how to change brake pads or check oil, Eli would ask questions about why the school closed down its music program, about why the hospital had fewer doctors every year, about why their neighbors sometimes had to drive 2 towns over just to get affordable medicine. His father, patient but weary, would shrug and say, "That's just how things are." But Eli wasn't satisfied with just how things are. He would sneak into the local library after shifts at the shop, pulling down newspapers and thick policy books that most kids his age would never touch. At first it was just curiosity, but curiosity turned into anger, and anger turned into determination. One evening, while flipping through a worn copy of the local paper, he came across an article about proposed cuts to healthcare funding in their state. He read it once, twice, then a third time, circling lines with a borrowed pen. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered under his breath. "This isn't right." That was the first time he realized that his voice, if only he learned to use it, could fight back against the things that felt so untouchable. Opportunity came not in the form of a grand stage, but a wrinkled flyer pinned to the bulletin board of that same library. It read, "Community Debate Night, all ages welcome, Thursday, 6 p.m. Eli stared at it for a long time before pulling it down, folding it carefully, and tucking it into his back pocket. The next Thursday, after wiping his hands on a grease rag and scrubbing them in cold water until the smell of oil faded just enough, he walked into the town hall where the debate was being held. The room was small, dimly lit, with maybe 20 folding chairs arranged in a circle. The people there weren't polished or prestigious. They were teachers, retirees, students, and a few curious onlookers. No one noticed Eli at first, sitting in the back, until the moderator, an older man with wire-frame glasses, turned toward him after a volunteer backed out of a round. "You there," the man said, pointing with a gentle smile. "Would you like to give it a try?" "Just 3 minutes." "Nothing fancy." Eli hesitated, then nodded, his palms sweaty as he took a seat at the front. The topic, chosen at random, was police budgets. He had no notes, no cards, no preparation. But something inside him unlocked. He spoke about the difference between fear and safety in his town, about how people wanted to trust the people who protected them, not fear them. He spoke about fairness, about balance, about dignity. When he finished, silence hung in the air. Not the mocking kind, real silence, the kind that means people are thinking. The man with glasses leaned back, folded his arms, and nodded. "I'm Billings," he said simply. "You ever thought about competing?" That night changed everything. Mr. Billings was no longer an active coach. He had spent 30 years training high school debaters before retiring, but something about Eli pulled him out of that quiet retirement. There was a rawness in Eli's voice, a kind of unpolished fire that Billings recognized as rare. The next week, they began meeting in the dusty back room of the library. Surrounded by crooked chairs and encyclopedias too old to be useful, they tore apart arguments and built them back up again. Eli learned how to structure logic, how to anticipate rebuttals, how to weave statistics into human stories. At first, he stumbled. He spoke too fast, lost his train of thought, fumbled over counter-arguments. But Billings never let him quit. "You've got fire, Eli," the old man said one evening, tapping his temple. "Now you need form, and form only comes with work," so Eli worked. He practiced in front of mirrors. He argued with the radio during long drives. He recited speeches while fixing cars with his father, to the confusion of customers who overheard him. Slowly, painfully, he began to transform from a boy with passion into a speaker with purpose. His first competitions were small, regional events at community centers and high schools. He lost more than he won. Judges told him his blazer didn't fit, that his accent was too heavy, that his delivery was too unrefined. Competitors mocked his sneakers and smirked at his background. But for every loss, he came back sharper. For every smirk, he built a stronger case. What they couldn't mock, what they couldn't shake, was the way audiences leaned in when he spoke about real people, real struggles, real stories that weren't pulled from textbooks, but from life itself. He spoke about his mother's double shifts, about his neighbor who rationed her medication, about his community scraping by while policymakers played games with numbers. Slowly, judges began to notice. Slowly, the laughter turned to silence. By the time he stood at Yale's Sterling Hall staring out at a sea of polished ambition, Eli was no longer just the boy from Brookhaven. He was the boy who had fought through nights of self-doubt, who had faced ridicule and loss, who had learned that his voice was his weapon. And as the crowd chuckled at his shoes and his blazer, as competitors whispered and smirked, Eli Ramirez took a steady breath and looked across the room without fear. He didn't need to be one of them. He didn't need their cologne, their cufflinks, their pedigrees. He had something else. He had truth, and when he finally opened his mouth to speak, the room that had mocked him would soon forget to breathe. Forged in silence. The weeks that followed that first community debate were not glamorous. There were no medals, no headlines, no sudden applause from the world. What there was instead were long evenings in a back room of the Brookhaven Library, where the fluorescent lights hummed faintly, where the walls were lined with outdated encyclopedias that smelled faintly of dust, and where two people, a retired coach and a boy from nowhere, sat across a crooked table dissecting arguments until their voices grew hoarse. Billings was relentless in a way Eli had never experienced before. "Passion is the spark," the old man would say, tapping the table for emphasis. "But without discipline, it burns out in smoke. You want to be heard, Eli? Then you need precision. You need to know not just why you believe something, but why it will stand against anyone who tries to knock it down." Eli would leave those sessions with a head that throbbed. Pages of notes filled with diagrams of arguments, logical chains, and rebuttals that seemed more like puzzles than speeches. Yet he kept coming back. Not because it was easy, but because something in him knew this was the path he was meant to walk. Still, transformation was not instant. The first time Eli entered an actual competition outside the safety of Brookhaven, he felt every pair of eyes marking him as an outsider. The regional invitational was held in a high school gymnasium 2 towns over, and most of the competitors were dressed in fitted suits that made Eli's borrowed blazer look like it belonged at a yard sale. When he stood to speak, a group of polished private school students whispered just loudly enough for him to hear. His heart pounded in his chest, and though his words came, they stumbled out unevenly as though tripping over each other. His arguments were sound, but his delivery lacked confidence, and the judges scribbled on their score sheets with looks that betrayed disappointment. He lost badly that day, and as he sat on the bleachers afterward, watching the others exchange congratulations and laughter, he wondered if he had been foolish to think he belonged in their world at all. It was Billings who brought him back from the brink of quitting. That evening, as Eli sat slouched at their usual library table, staring at his notes without seeing them, Billings leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "Do you know why they laughed at you?" the old man asked. Eli shrugged, bitterness rising in his chest. "Because I don't belong here. Because I don't have what they have." Billings slammed his palm flat against the table, startling Eli into looking up. "No, they laughed because they're afraid. They sense that underneath your nerves, underneath that second-hand blazer, you've got something they can't imitate, truth. But truth without confidence is wasted. Do you want to waste it?" That question lit a spark in Eli that shame could not extinguish. From then on, practice turned into something closer to a ritual. Mornings before his shifts at the garage, Eli would stand in front of the bathroom mirror rehearsing opening statements until his throat grew raw. Evenings after dinner, he would sit at the kitchen table while his father read the paper, practicing rebuttals aloud until his father finally lowered the pages and muttered, "Kid, you sound like you're arguing with the whole world." To which Eli would grin faintly and reply, "Maybe I am." At night, when the house was quiet, he would sit by the window with a stack of index cards, writing, rewriting, and discarding drafts until only the sharpest words remained. The turning point came at a state-level competition months later. The auditorium was small, but the stakes felt massive. Eli's opponent was a boy from a well-funded private academy, the kind of student who spoke as if he had been preparing his entire life for these contests. When Eli walked on stage, the whispers began again. His shoes were scuffed. His accent marked him as working class, and for a moment the old shame threatened to pull him under. But then he remembered Billings' words. Truth without confidence is wasted, and he straightened his shoulders. He opened not with statistics or jargon, but with a story. He spoke of his mother's friend, a woman who had worked 2 jobs yet could not afford the medication her daughter needed. He wove numbers into that story like threads, but the heart of his case was human, undeniable. The room grew quiet. Judges who had been scribbling paused to look up. And for the first time, Eli felt the shift, not pity, not mockery, but respect. He did not win first place that day, but he placed high enough to advance. More importantly, he realized something vital. People listened when he spoke from the marrow of his own experience. Billings noticed the change, too. "You're beginning to find your rhythm," he said afterward, his lined face breaking into the faintest of smiles. "Not every argument is won with numbers. Sometimes it's won with heart. But heart needs armor. We'll keep sharpening." And sharpen they did. Week after week, they tackled new topics: foreign policy, climate change, healthcare systems, education funding. Eli learned how to dismantle complex arguments piece by piece, how to pivot gracefully when caught off guard, how to stand tall even when the tide seemed against him. The losses grew fewer. The wins came more often. And with each victory, no matter how small, the boy from Brookhaven began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could stand among the best. Yet with each step forward came a new wave of doubt. At larger competitions, he still drew stares. His clothes, his background, his very presence seemed to scream outsider. There were nights when he returned home exhausted, dropping his notes onto the floor and collapsing into bed, wondering why he was putting himself through this. But then he would remember the faces of the people he spoke for, the neighbor rationing her medicine, the factory worker fighting for fair wages, his own father rubbing his sore hands after 12 hours at the shop. They were the reason he kept going. He wasn't just debating for trophies or prestige. He was debating because someone needed to tell those stories in rooms where no one else would. When the invitation finally came for the national tournament, Eli almost couldn't believe it. The envelope was plain, but the seal on the letterhead was unmistakable. Sterling Hall, Yale University. For a long moment he sat staring at it, his hands trembling. This was the stage that had launched senators, governors, policy leaders. It was a place reserved for the elite, the polished, the pedigreed. And yet somehow it was calling to a mechanic's son from Brookhaven. He showed the letter to Billings, who simply nodded, his expression proud but calm. "I told you, Eli," the old man said quietly. If you carry truth with confidence, there is no room in the world you do not belong. The weeks leading up to Yale were the hardest Eli had ever endured. Every spare moment was poured into preparation. He read policy reports late into the night, memorized case law, rehearsed arguments until the words felt etched into his bones. Billings drilled him on counter-arguments, sometimes playing devil's advocate so sharply that Eli would storm out in frustration, only to return the next day more determined than before. His father, though he did not always understand the intricacies of debate, supported him in his own way, packing him extra sandwiches for late-night study sessions, patting him on the shoulder before competitions, and once even fixing his old blazer with careful stitches so it wouldn't look quite so worn. These small acts of faith fueled Eli more than any trophy ever could. When at last he boarded the bus for Yale, carrying nothing more than a single suitcase and a battered stack of index cards, he felt the weight of his entire town on his shoulders. Brookhaven wasn't the kind of place that usually sent its children to ivy-clad halls of power. But Eli wasn't just going for himself. He was going for every voice that had been ignored, for every story that had been dismissed, for every person who had been told they didn't belong. And though fear gnawed at him as the bus rolled eastward, he carried with him a fire that no amount of mockery could extinguish. He had been forged in silence, in dusty libraries and quiet kitchens, in nights where only his own voice reminded him he could do this. And soon, on the grandest stage of them all, that voice would finally be heard. Clash with the elite. The first thing Eli noticed about Yale's Sterling Hall was the sheer weight of history pressing down on its stone walls. The building stood tall and proud, every archway carved with detail, every corridor lined with portraits of men and women who had shaped policy, law, and even nations. He walked through its entrance, clutching his worn suitcase in one hand and his stack of index cards in the other, feeling like he had stepped into a world he had only ever seen in glossy magazines or television dramas. Students in tailored suits and polished shoes strode past him with an air of casual entitlement, their conversation sprinkled with names of senators, professors, and firms as if these were family friends. He caught glimpses of parents who looked like executives and judges, mingling comfortably in the hallways, their presence radiating quiet power. For a moment, Eli felt invisible, just another face passing through. But the truth was he wasn't invisible at all. He was noticeable in all the wrong ways. As he crossed the lobby, a group of competitors standing near the registration desk turned to glance at him. Their eyes moved from his second-hand blazer to the scuffed sneakers on his feet, and though they said nothing directly, the smirk on one boy's face was loud enough. Eli signed in, his hand steady despite the murmurs around him, and received his schedule for the preliminary rounds. Room 203, 10 a.m. The words seemed ordinary enough on the paper, but he knew the weight they carried. This was the beginning of the fight he had trained, for Coach Billings had not come with him. His health had grown too, fragile for travel, but he had left Eli with parting words, over the phone the night before. Remember, they'll try to intimidate you with polish, with pedigree, with confidence that's been rehearsed since birth. Don't fight them on their turf. Make them fight on yours. Speak the language of truth. They won't know what to do with it. Eli carried those words like armor as he made his way to the first round. The room was filled with competitors who looked like they had stepped straight out of law school brochures. His opponent that morning was a young woman from Princeton, crisp navy suit, pearls glinting faintly under the fluorescent light. Her speech was flawless, delivered with the precision of someone who had been coached by the best. But Eli had learned his lesson from months of practice. Flawless was not the same as compelling. When it was his turn, he placed his index cards gently on the podium and spoke with steady calm. He told a story about a family in his town who had lost their home because of predatory lending practices, weaving in data that supported the larger point about economic inequality. His tone wasn't theatrical, but it was grounded. When he finished, the judge, a professor from Georgetown, leaned back in his chair and studied him for a long moment, before scribbling something on his pad. Eli won that round by a slim margin. The victories that followed were never easy. In each round, Eli faced competitors who had been molded for this stage, their rhetoric sharp as steel, their confidence unshaken. Yet time and again, his sincerity broke through their polish. While they quoted theorists and cited precedents with rehearsed fluency, Eli connected those abstract points back to real lives. He made people see not just numbers but neighbors, not just policies but parents, children, and workers. Slowly he began to notice the shift. The laughter that had followed him into rooms gave way to silence, the kind that meant people were listening. By the end of the preliminary rounds, he had advanced further than anyone expected, including himself. It was during one of these rounds that Eli first came face to face with Dominic Hale. Dominic was everything Eli was not: tall, immaculately dressed in a bespoke suit, his hair styled perfectly, his presence commanding from the moment he stepped into a room. He was Harvard's star, the undefeated champion whose speeches had become the stuff of legend in debate circles. Rumor had it that his father was a senior partner at one of the nation's largest law firms, and his mother sat on the board of a think tank in Washington. Dominic carried himself like someone born to be listened to, like someone who had never once in his life been told he didn't belong. When their eyes met across the room, Dominic's lips curved into a smile that was not friendly but sharp, like a blade being unsheathed. He approached Eli during the break, his voice smooth and polished. "Brookhaven, right? That's what they said about you. Small-town kid, community college, the mechanic's son. Impressive that you've made it this far." "Really it is." His tone carried no genuine admiration. It was laced with condescension so thinly veiled it almost glittered. "But the Nationals are different. This isn't the place for stories from gas stations and garages. It's the place for ideas that shape nations. Be careful not to confuse the two." With that, he offered a mock polite nod and walked away, leaving Eli standing in the hallway with a heat rising in his chest that was not embarrassment, but resolve. The next rounds tested Eli in ways he had not anticipated. The questions were sharper, the rebuttals faster, the judges less forgiving. There were moments when he faltered, moments when Dominic's words echoed in his head, threatening to pull him back into self-doubt. But each time he fought through it. He remembered Billings' advice: make them fight on your turf. And his turf was not privilege, it was truth. So he leaned harder into it. He spoke not just of policy, but of people. He reminded judges that behind every statistic was a face, a family, a life. By the time the semifinal results were announced, Sterling Hall was abuzz with whispers. Eli Ramirez, the unknown, the outsider, had advanced to the final round. The announcement sent a ripple through the crowd, half disbelief, half anticipation. Some said he was lucky, that his opponents had underestimated him. Others said there was something raw and unshakable about the way he spoke. Something that made you feel as though you couldn't dismiss him no matter how hard you tried. And then came the final pairing, posted on the board in bold black letters: final round, Eli Ramirez, Brookhaven Community College versus Dominic Hale, Harvard University. The room went still as people crowded around to read it. Dominic, standing nearby, glanced at Eli and smiled that same sharp smile. "Looks like it's you and me," he said smoothly. "Don't take it personally when this ends badly for you. Some stages just aren't meant for certain people." His words might have been meant to cut, but Eli only nodded, calm, almost serene, because deep down he knew this was exactly where his path had been leading all along. The clash was inevitable. The outsider against the golden boy. The truth-teller against the polished rhetorician. The boy from nowhere against the heir of everything. And as Eli prepared to step onto that stage for the final time, with the weight of his town, his family, and every silent struggle he carried in his heart, he knew one thing for certain. He had not come this far just to be dismissed. He had come to make them listen. The final stage, the grand auditorium at Yale, was nothing like the classrooms Eli had debated in before. Its vaulted ceiling stretched high above, its walls draped with banners from past champions, each embroidered with names that read like a history of America's elite institutions. Rows upon rows of polished wooden seats climbed upward, packed with spectators, professors, alumni, students, and even visiting journalists who had come to witness the nation's best debaters clash in the final round. The stage itself gleamed under the spotlight, 2 lecterns standing at opposite ends like dueling swords ready to be drawn. The air was charged, thick with anticipation. This was not just a debate. It was theater. It was battle. It was judgment. And standing at one of those lecterns was Eli Ramirez, the boy from Brookhaven, his heart steady despite the weight of the moment. Dominic Hale stood at the opposite end, immaculate in a charcoal suit that looked tailored to perfection, his posture flawless, his confidence radiating outward as if he had already claimed the trophy in his mind. He greeted the judges with a smile so polished it could have been rehearsed in front of a mirror for years. The crowd murmured with excitement, some already whispering that the outcome was inevitable. Dominic was the reigning champion of every regional tournament, undefeated, the embodiment of pedigree and preparation. Eli, on the other hand, was the anomaly, the outsider who had clawed his way here against all odds. Many were curious to see if his streak of upsets would end now. On the biggest stage of all, the resolution for the final round was announced. Resolved, in times of global crisis, governments must prioritize collective welfare over individual freedoms. A topic designed to test not just logic but moral vision, the kind that demanded debaters not only argue but inspire. Dominic went first. He began with poise, his voice smooth and commanding, drawing on centuries of philosophy, quoting Locke and Rousseau, weaving in modern examples from international law and public policy. His diction was flawless, his gestures controlled, his tone imbued with authority. As he spoke, heads in the audience nodded, impressed by the ease with which he constructed a fortress of argument around his position. When he concluded, the applause was immediate, polite, but strong. He had set a high bar. Then it was Eli's turn. He approached the lectern slowly, placing his worn index cards down without looking at them. For a moment, the room seemed to lean forward, waiting for him to stumble, waiting for the cracks of inexperience to show. But when Eli began to speak, his voice carried not polish but weight. He didn't open with philosophers or policy frameworks. He opened with a story. "I come from a town that most of you have never heard of," he began, his eyes scanning the crowd, his voice firm but unadorned. "A place where the library closed 3 years ago because there wasn't enough funding, where the clinic runs on donations, where families live one illness away from losing everything. When the pandemic hit, it wasn't theory, it was life and death. My neighbor, a father of 3, lost his job at the factory, and with it his health insurance. He couldn't afford his medicine anymore. I watched him struggle until he didn't make it. That's what collective welfare means. It's not abstract. It's not a debate prompt. It's people. People who don't have the safety nets that others take for granted." There was a stillness in the auditorium as his words sank in. Eli did not speak quickly. He spoke with the deliberate rhythm of someone who wanted to be understood, not admired. He drew connections between policy and pain, between freedom and responsibility, painting pictures of real lives behind the resolution. He acknowledged the value of individual rights, but he made the case that true freedom could not exist without a community strong enough to support it. His argument was not a fortress of theory, but a bridge, and the audience found themselves walking across it almost without realizing. Dominic countered with surgical precision. He dissected Eli's points with cold logic, reminding the judges that emotional appeals could cloud judgment. He spoke of slippery slopes, of governments that abused power under the guise of protecting welfare, citing historical examples where freedoms once surrendered were never regained. His rebuttals were sharp, almost ruthless, aimed at cutting Eli's argument down to its bones. And yet when Eli rose again, he did not fight fire with fire. Instead, he acknowledged Dominic's points with respect and then reframed the issue, asking a question that hung in the air like a challenge to everyone listening. "What good is freedom?" Eli asked quietly. "To someone who is too sick, too hungry, or too broken to use it?" He paused, letting the silence carry the weight of his words. "We talk about freedom as if it lives in documents and declarations. But freedom is only real when it can be lived. And without the welfare of the community, freedom becomes a privilege for the few, not a right for all." The crowd shifted, murmurs rising, and for the first time, Dominic's composure seemed to falter ever so slightly. His smile stiffened, his replies quicker, almost defensive. Eli pressed on, not with aggression but with conviction, weaving together facts and lived experiences, reminding the room that the debate was not about theory but humanity. By the time closing statements arrived, the tension in the auditorium was palpable. Dominic ended with a call to vigilance against tyranny, urging the judges to protect liberty above all else. It was strong, commanding, textbook perfect. But when Eli stepped forward for his final words, there was no textbook guiding him, only the weight of truth. "I didn't come here to win a trophy," he said, his voice steady, carrying to the farthest corners of the hall. "I came here because my community believes that even someone like me, from a place like mine, deserves to be heard. I came here because debate isn't just about words, it's about what words can do. If they can change the course of one mind, one policy, one future, then every late night of practice was worth it. So I ask you not to judge me on how polished I am, but on whether my words spoke to something real. Because out there, beyond these walls, it's not polish that saves lives. It's truth. And truth doesn't care where you come from. When he finished, the hall erupted, not with polite applause, but with a roar that rolled through the room like a wave. Some stood clapping, others shouted their approval. Eli did not bask in it. He simply stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding, his breath steady. Dominic stood at his lectern clapping as well. Though his smile had hardened, the easy certainty of victory no longer written on his face. The judges filed their notes with expressions that gave nothing away. Their deliberations cloaked in silence. The room buzzed with speculation, voices rising and falling in heated whispers. And as Eli sat waiting for the verdict, he realized something profound. Whether he won or lost, he had already proven something that no one could take away. He had stood on the same stage as the best of the best, and he had not been overshadowed. He had spoken, and they had listened. The final announcement would come soon, and with it either triumph or heartbreak. But for Eli, in that moment, the victory had already begun. The verdict and its consequences. The judges took longer than usual to deliberate, and in that span of silence, the air inside Sterling Hall became suffocating. The crowd murmured like restless waves, their voices blending into a low hum of speculation. Some whispered confidently that Dominic had edged Eli with technical precision. Others swore that the raw truth of Eli's words had already decided the outcome. Students from Ivy League schools leaned toward each other, debating the very debate itself, while faculty members sat with arms crossed, eyes narrowing in thought. The tension was a rope drawn tight, and Eli sat at his table, his hands folded, his face calm, but his mind racing. He wasn't afraid. He had made peace with the possibility of loss, but a part of him, the part that remembered every night he had practiced until dawn, every page he had studied until his vision blurred, still longed for the validation of hearing his name called. Finally, the judges returned. They carried envelopes, their expressions neutral, giving nothing away. Dr. Lanning, the head of the panel, stepped forward to the podium. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes that had measured thousands of arguments in her lifetime, eyes that now swept over the crowd before landing on the two young men standing on opposite sides of the stage. She tapped the microphone and the room fell silent. You could hear the creak of a chair, the faint cough of someone in the back row, the collective inhale of hundreds of people holding their breath at once. This year's National Debate Invitational final round, she began. Her voice calm, deliberate, was among the most difficult we have judged. Both competitors demonstrated not only mastery of rhetoric but also depth of conviction. One embodied precision, the other authenticity. Both left us with much to consider. She paused, letting the weight of her words linger. Dominic stood tall, chin lifted, his expression serene as though already rehearsing his acceptance. Eli remained still, his gaze steady, his body language betraying no expectation, only patience. The decision, Dr. Lanning continued, was not unanimous. The panel was divided, but in the end the margin was narrow and the vote was cast. By a decision of 3-2, the winner of the 72nd National Debate Invitational is. The pause seemed endless. The audience leaned forward as though drawn by a magnet. Eli Ramirez, representing Brookhaven College. For a moment, the hall was stunned into silence, as if the collective brain of the audience needed a second to register what had just been said. Then it happened. The explosion of sound, a thunderclap of applause, cheers, even shouts. People rose to their feet, clapping with a fervor that echoed off the ancient wooden beams of the ceiling. Some students whistled, some stomped their feet. The sound was not just congratulation. It was a wave of acknowledgement that someone had defied the expected order of things and come out victorious. Eli stood, his expression calm, but his chest rose with a breath that felt like the release of years of struggle. He nodded once to the judges, then to the crowd, not with arrogance, but with gratitude. Dominic clapped as well, though slower, his polite smile masking a shadow of disbelief. For the first time in years, the titan of the circuit had fallen, and he had fallen to a boy who had walked onto that stage in worn shoes and an old blazer. The trophy was presented, a gleaming piece of polished silver engraved with the name of the competition. When it was placed in Eli's hands, the weight of it seemed unreal. He didn't lift it over his head or shout in triumph. Instead, he held it close, his fingers tracing the cool metal, as though grounding himself in the reality of the moment. The cameras flashed, the audience roared again, and still, Eli stood rooted. A boy from nowhere who had just proven he belonged everywhere. After the ceremony, reporters swarmed. Microphones were thrust toward him, questions fired rapidly. How does it feel to defeat Dominic Hale? What does this victory mean for community colleges? Did you ever expect to come this far? Eli answered with humility, each response tethered not to his own glory but to the people he represented. This isn't just for me, he said, his voice steady. This is for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong in rooms like this. It's for every kid who studies under streetlights or in public libraries because they don't have a quiet place at home. If my win says anything, it's that talent, passion, and truth don't wear labels. They can come from anywhere. His words, carried by dozens of recorders and cameras, spread far beyond the walls of Yale, rippling into headlines, news feeds, and conversations across campuses nationwide. But the story didn't end with applause or headlines. In the days that followed, Eli's life shifted in ways he could hardly have imagined. Emails flooded his inbox, invitations to speak at universities, offers of internships from think tanks and nonprofits, letters from professors who wanted him in their programs. Scholarships that had once seemed unattainable were suddenly offered with urgency, as if the world had only just realized what he could do. Back in Brookhaven, his victory was celebrated like a holiday. The community center hung a banner across its front doors. Congratulations, Eli, you made us proud. Children who had once seen debate as something distant now began to attend workshops at the library. Inspired by the boy who proved they could dream beyond the borders of their town, parents who had worked double shifts and still struggled to provide felt a sense of vindication, a reminder that their sacrifices were not invisible. Uncle Royce, usually gruff and skeptical, wiped at his eyes when he saw Eli step off the bus with the trophy in his hands. You didn't just win, kid, he muttered, pulling Eli into a rough embrace. You changed the damn rules. And yet for Eli, the victory was not a finish line but a beginning. He sat in his room one night, the trophy gleaming faintly on his desk under the lamplight, and thought about what came next. Winning the tournament had proven something to the world, but it also placed a responsibility on his shoulders. He had been given a platform, and he knew he couldn't waste it on self-congratulation. He thought about the neighbor who had died because he couldn't afford medicine, about the friends back home who would never have the chance to stand on a stage at Yale, about every voice still drowned out by privilege and power. That night, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would not let this moment be remembered as a fluke or a single victory frozen in time. He would use it as fuel, to keep speaking, to keep fighting, to open doors for others who came after him. The world had laughed when he stepped onto the stage. Now it listened, and he intended to make sure it never forgot the sound of his voice. In the years that followed, people would remember the debate not just as the year Eli Ramirez won, but as the year the culture of competition shifted. It was the year audiences stopped equating polish with truth, the year judges began to look not just for precision but for purpose. And somewhere deep in the memory of every person who had been there lingered the image of a young man in a second-hand blazer, standing in the spotlight, holding a trophy that was never meant for him, and claiming it not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated, because in the end it wasn't just a debate, it was a declaration, a statement that brilliance could bloom in unlikely soil, that truth spoken with conviction could shatter walls built by centuries of privilege. And long after the applause faded, long after the cameras left, long after the headlines disappeared, that declaration remained. Eli Ramirez had walked onto a stage where few believed he belonged. He walked off having redefined what belonging meant.